Take a few seconds and then
All right. Hello, hello. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Chantrice. I'm an organizer with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, and today we are going to be reviewing the budget hearing from a couple days ago for LMPD. As many of you are aware, Metro is now hearing from different departments in the city about the mayor's budget, his proposed budget for 2021 and 2022. We heard from LMPD, and we're going to be recapping that. I'm joined by my colleagues today, Corey, who is with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, as well as Rebecca, who does the Louisville Community Bail Fund. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a moment. But first, I just want to go over some of the things we're going to cover today. First, we're going to talk about some highlights from the budget hearing from LMPD, which featured Police Chief Shields. We're going to talk about alternatives to policing. We'll then have a group discussion and some audience questions, followed by a call to action. I'm really excited to have Rebecca specifically on the call. I love Corey too, of course, because she's done a lot of work in data. And that's one of the things that was really lacking in the conversation with LMPD. Police Chief Erica Shields was asked budget questions by Metro Council, and about half of those answers were either I don't know, or I don't have that information, or someone else was supposed to do that. She simply didn't have an answer to at least half of the questions. And that's, for me, that's alarming. This budget for the police specifically is over $200 million. There's not only the budget that is underneath LMPD as a heading, right? There's also other budget line items that don't say LMPD specifically, like IT and personnel and professional services, that are going to go to LMPD. So the budget is misleading, and we want to make sure people are well informed. And I know that my son, as a second grader, has to have all the answers for his presentations. So I think it's only right that a grown-up who's in charge of a multi-million-dollar budget should have simple answers for budget questions. And before I check in with Corey and Rebecca, I'm just going to go over a couple of the questions that went without an answer. So one question that was asked by McCraney was she wanted to find out where the FOP contract was and what reforms had already been agreed to. And Chief Shields essentially said, well, I tell you, I don't know. Do you have a time frame? The answer was no, ma'am. Piangentini asked how intelligence-led policing became the anchor. And the police chief responded with another question saying, how do you determine how you're going to police? I don't know. Let's see, Armstrong asked specifically about the $300,000 for fixed license plate readers and $325,000 mobile data capture program. There was a question about how the data is stored, who the data is shared with, and the police chief did not have the answer. She specifically said, I had to look that up because I wasn't immediately familiar with that. And yes, some people will say she's only been on the job, 5 months? But those of you who've ever had a job know that 5 months is more than enough time to learn your job. There was also a question from Councilman Arthur that asked, can someone provide us a total dollar amount for the police budget? The total within the section, as I mentioned earlier, does not include other line items that go to LMPD. She did not have an answer for that. When Hollander asked her for a timeline on a lot of these, she did not have a timeline. She specifically said, no, I thought that we would be there by now. That was the commitment. When asked by President James if the incident in Jefferson Square Park where police assaulted a peaceful protester, if there was an idea when the investigation would be completed, again, she said, I would have to ask. I thought about that. I should have had that before this meeting. So she's aware of her responsibility, but is obviously not accountable. Some of her other answers included, well, overall, I don't know. We haven't had that discussion. And sometimes she simply said in process, or she did not have an answer. And again, people will say that she's only been on the job for 5 months or so, give her some time, but people are dying. The homicide solve rate is less than 30%, even though the total budget for LMPD is about 40%. So the return on investment is laughable at this point. And Erica will often say in public that the reason they're not able to solve is because they don't have the money. But the evidence is to the contrary. When you look at the budget over the years, each year that we increase the LMPD budget, the solve rate for homicides actually goes down. So she's putting the cart before the horse, essentially. And it's obvious that more money is not going to solve the problem because police cannot keep us safe. They have not kept us safe. I've talked to a lot of residents, especially in the West End, who are really concerned that the police spent so much money on riot gear and on tear gas. I was one of the people who was tear gas, and I'm still feeling the health impacts of that, right? But they're not spending the time and resources to actually solve homicides. And that's a big concern. Now, I want to bring in Corey and Rebecca. Can y'all talk to me a little bit about some of the failures of LMPD? What are some of the ways, essentially, that they've wasted money that would go to a reason why we shouldn't give them more money and essentially reward them for their failure? And either one of you can jump in.
Who wants to start? Who wants to start with the worst of the worst? I think something that's really coming to my mind is the response to the protests and then the budget this year. So although they used tear gas against protesters, although they dressed up in full riot gear and got the National Guard involved and hurt peaceful protesters, they're asking for huge increases in weapons and barricades and horses and things that they use to literally harm people every day in this city. So there's a direct connection between how they responded to us last year and how they plan to respond to us in the future.
Yeah, that's absolutely on point. And Shields even said, I should just call her Erica. Erica even said that they plan to continue business as usual. When asked about the COVID response by Councilman Hollander, I believe it was, she said that we're going to continue as we have been for the last year. And as we know, within the last year, you know, we've had police assaults, we've had all types of police misconduct and misuse of funds. So her goal is to continue that same practice, which is very alarming to me, especially for someone who claims to want to improve policing. She even, when asked by McCraney, what is community policing? Her response was that community policing is when people believe in the police. And that is so far from community policing. So it just shows how off base she is. And Rebecca, you're one of the people who's doing a lot of work around not just data, but around what happens when someone is arrested and does or doesn't have bail posted, and then it's posted, but they have barriers. So can you talk a little bit about that and why it's important to really scrutinize this budget?
Yeah. So for me, the number one thing that sort of jumps out is the technology. There is a massive jump. There's a over $3 million increase in the mayor's recommended budget for computer licensing and hardwaring and software, and all of that is this intelligence-led policing that the chief talks about and that those around her are talking about. And what that ultimately money is going to do is it creates a culture of over-policing in Black neighborhoods, of surveillance, of constant surveillance. Chief Shields said that she doesn't know where the data goes and who it gets shared with, but it gets shared with any agency that asks for it. So we're talking about increasing a budget by millions and millions of dollars, and it's tucked in different places like the GVI program, the deflection model program. All of those things will get this increase in budget, and all that will go to this technology, and that just creates this constant state surveillance, and that then leads into the programs that do risk assessment for what your bond gets set to. That all gets interconnected. So then folks get higher bonds. So if you're over policing Black neighborhoods and they're getting worse charges, then they're going to be the ones that get the higher bonds, and then the ones that end up incarcerated for years in pretrial detention, and then they can't defend themselves. And so it's a cycle that this budget really is padded to sort of increase.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to talk a little bit about the deflection program, which you mentioned. Councilman Arthur the other night said specifically last year, in looking at professional services for LMPD, there's a little over $900,000. And this year there's a proposed $4.6 million. And he asked her to explain these. And Shields or Erica's response was that the bulk of this is to fund the deflection program. But then she later admitted that the police should not be running these services, that they are not trained for that. There are actually people who are better at it, like social service workers. So there's a lot of contradiction within this, which again, as someone who has handled multi-million-dollar budgets, these answers concern me. It's fiscally irresponsible to, on one hand, say, my department, my officers are not equipped for this. This is not something we should be doing. And then a minute later saying, please give us millions of dollars so we can do this, even though we just said we can't handle it and we shouldn't handle it. And thank you for joining us too, Shantae. And you can chime in on this as well. What, for the deflection program specifically, this is $4.6 million, which is a substantial increase from professional services last year. What is the danger of giving the police this money for a program that they've admitted they are not qualified to run?
Yeah. Hey, everybody. So, just kind of piggybacking on what Rebecca said, the problem is, and I think some people asked some questions about this, is that we're talking about the deflection model, but what all does that include? Because you may have already talked about GVI. We talked about LMPD having a budget outside of the official LMPD budget. So it's really important to listen to the different facets of what they're talking about with the budget, because where we see the increase with the deflection model that they shouldn't be using, we need to understand how that overlaps into GVI programs and what the funding, might look like. Because we already see in the budget that they're asking, like for synergy projects where we're requesting $600,000 to do community relations programs. You just talked about the $4.5 million for the deflection model. At the same time, they have some of their budget embedded in other metro departments. So, for example, for GVI, the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods has $220,000 to go towards that program. So it was really unclear about how the deflection model, how GVI comes together, and how they really plan on spending the money. You're very right that, Chief Shields said that they don't have the capacity to do that, yet we're looking at a $4 to $5 million increase in what is essentially their community relations budget, which goes into trailing Black and brown and poor people, showing up at funerals of their friends and trying to interconnect people, so that we're moving more into this surveillance state, which is very dangerous. So we're just using different language to talk about increasing technology and surveillance of Black and brown communities. I'm sure we'll talk about shot spotters later, but all of these things are tied into over surveillance of our communities, and we all know there's a grave danger with that.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that for a second, because Shields, she talked about how if she had money, she would put officers on the streets walking around because, surveillance is not the way, because the cops need to be like in the neighborhood. So yet another point of contradiction. Is it that she wants to increase technology, which she told Piangentini, she wants to make technology a cornerstone of the budget or a big part of her budget. But at the same time, she said that technology is possibly not the way, and there should be actual police officers on the ground on horses. So, if this were a company shareholder meeting, which all of us in the city are pretty much shareholders when it comes to this budget, I think we would vote against this as a group. And I don't know how much the Metro Council members are looking at the Facebook comments and the messages that we're sending on their budget comment form, but it doesn't sound like people want this. It sounds like the only folks who are really gung-ho about this is potentially the police department, the mayor, and other people who are not impacted directly and negatively by this spending. We can go ahead and jump into some of the specifics, Shantae. We did talk about the fact that she answered either I don't know or she just didn't have an answer to about half the questions. But I want to talk a little bit more about why the Louisville Metro Police Department is being investigated by the Department of Justice, because that was not brought up at all, which I was surprised by. If someone is under investigation, I think it's uncouth to then ask for millions of dollars as a raise. If you're on probation at work, you don't then say, you know what, though, I'd like a promotion. So if y'all could just talk a little bit about how wild it is that while they're under investigation by the Department of Justice for all the wrongdoings and the racism and the misappropriation of funds and assaulting children in their own program, like how I can't reconcile that in my mind. So if y'all could just talk a little bit about that.
I'll say that's a little bit unsettling, because part of the conversation yesterday, we talked about the incentive for officers to move into some of these communities that they're policing as part of the settlement with Breonna Taylor's family. And it was asked, how many officers have taken advantage of that? And the answer was none. And, that is very disheartening when we're talking about a one-page application to receive $5,000 in assistance to do what you say you want to do, which is to move into the community. So if we're not even having officers move in, and then it was exposed that officers don't even know how to apply for this one-page application program, and that instead of going to human resources, instead of going to the FOP, they're going to Councilman David James to ask how they can apply. And as a councilman, he doesn't know how to tell them to complete this one-page application because they don't really want to be in the community. And so that DOJ investigation is really going to tear down the walls on this and expose LMPD about how they're doing the exact opposite of what it is that they say that they want to do as far as being integrated in the community. They want to be integrated, but they want to be on a telephone pole and a camera with a computer, shot spotters and things like that. They don't want to live with us, but they want to be able to surveil us.
Right. And if they're saying the issue is the officers need more money, and here is a one-stop program to get $5,000 and not a single officer took advantage of it, that kind of contradicts what Erica said previously. And, I've seen in a lot of cities when police want more community engagement by way of technology, it's usually just to pad their own budget. And that reform, that community engagement, it never comes to fruition. I think it was President James who talked about, different cities and the milestones they've met and how we could maybe do some of those same initiatives. And the police here are not about that at all. They are absolutely unwilling to change in a way that helps Black people, poor people, and those who are disenfranchised. It's sad that no matter how many people in the city call for Reconstruction, we have more of the same. And we're actually living in the reform that they promised years ago when they promised body cams. Back when Michael Newby got shot in the back, there were promises of reform, and we're living in that reform. So it makes me a little sad when folks like Shields, say that we're working on reform, I guarantee you this time next year, if she's still the chief, guess what? She still will be working on it. I think it was Piangentini. No, it might have been can't remember which one it was. But one of our East End Council members asked specifically, like, are we 40% of the way? Are we 50% of the way towards your goal? Are we 80% of the way towards your goal? She said that we're 40%. But what does that mean? Because her vision seems to be recreating the status quo. So that, again, was concerning. And I'll read this quote from someone who was on, who watched the budget hearing yesterday. And then I want you all to talk specifically about your work and where else should this money be going, because $200 million is way too much for the police department here in Louisville. But there are social services and there are programs that are struggling just to get by. So I'll read this quote from Stuart and August Gentry. Even if you don't have a moral or ethical program with the actions of LMPD, and you should, speaking strictly from a fiscal standpoint, LMPD is currently closing under 30% of homicides. This is a putrid return on investment considering they get over 40% of the annual budget. And this stood out to me because, again, in any other company, any other situation, 30% return on investment when you're 40% of the budget would be unacceptable. So I want y'all to talk a little bit about somewhere that money can go instead.
Well, I sat through about 10 and a half hours of Metro Council hearings just this week, and there are more coming up next week. So I'm sure next week I'll have even more answers about where this money can go. But this past week, we heard from the Family Health Center, we heard from Public Works, and next week we'll hear from the library and from Parks. And all of these places, when you look in the budget, are being cut so that LMPD may be accommodated. And we've seen the value of our health department, of the family health centers. We have seen the value of those when we're in a literal pandemic and are still living through it. But our council people weren't pushing on that. Our council people weren't saying, you know what, you're right. I'm going to fight for you so that in the next pandemic, we're ready. And they weren't doing that. They were just saying, okay, moving on, not asking any questions. And that's so disheartening to think that folks in the comments can ask more budget related questions than the folks that were paying lots and lots of money to sit in offices on Jefferson.
Honey. Well, and it's wild that, and as someone, again, I've worked on budgets that are over $1 million and money just doesn't appear. So the fact that we're cutting some and increasing others means we are sacrificing some things in place of other things. So it sounds like, based on this budget, the mayor, the police department is totally fine with sacrificing the social services that would prevent the need for policing. And that is by design. That's not an accident. It's not a happy mistake. And people say that Erica is well-intentioned, but you as a grown adult who is managing budgets understands that by cutting some things, you're making way for other things. And again, if you're just tuning in, we are doing a budget recap. The mayor put forth his 2021-2022 budget proposal. And so this week and next week, the city council members are hearing from different departments. We're specifically talking about the Louisville Metro Police Department. They have more than $200 million proposed, not just under the heading of LMPD, but there are other line items across the budget outside of LMPD. Those funds would also go to LMPD. So it's over $200 million. We are still waiting on the Metro Police Department to tell us exactly how much. Even the police chief did not know exactly how much was going directly to the police department. And we're speaking with Shantae West and Rebecca and Corey from KFTC about where that money could go instead and what we can do as an alternative to policing, since even LMPD's chief admitted that they are not equipped to handle most of these issues. So yeah, I would love to hear from y'all on sort of where else the money can go, but what do you think it is that will help us stop this money from flowing towards police?
Well, here was one of the problems. So in previous budget hearings, there are usually a list of questions that Metro Council prepares when the different departments are making their presentation. And so usually there's written responses to a lot of the line items so that they're prepared when they come. And funny enough, I also have been watching budget hearings all week. Yesterday, we listened to the sanitation department, who was 1,000 times more prepared than LMPD. And even where Chief Shields doesn't know a lot, for example, the sanitation department had 5 or 6 people that were present at the meeting to answer where their lead could not. And they were very detailed about staffing shortages, what actual numbers were, the reason why people were leaving. They had detailed numbers about higher pay in the private sector. They talked about pensions. And so a lot of those things were missing from the LMPD budget discussion. But you asked, Chantrese, like where else we could use that money. A lot of that money could be shifted to, for example, the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods that came in and talked about a lot of the work that they were doing in the community and specifically contracting with grassroots organizations to do the actual work versus LMPD coming in and say, we plan to work with grassroots organizations, but had no response to how they are currently working with grassroots organizations. So they expect for there to be a raise in their, or an increase in their budget without defining line by line how they're going to spend that money. Yet at the same time, the council put our ocean head, Monique Williams, on the spot and said, if we give you an increase, how are you going to decrease the murders? So why that same question isn't asked by the people who are actually responsible for stopping the murders is really crazy. And so we're hoping that, for example, the Black Lives Matter Louisville Healing Team has been talking about preparing more Black clinicians to be in the field, to work in these metro departments like the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods, to make sure that these communities that we are working with have service providers who look like them and want to be in their community, not like these officers who can't even be paid $5,000 to live in these communities. So we need to do more work like the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods is doing with Pivot to Peace, going out and working with gun violence victims directly with other people who have knowledge and history and are embedded in the community that they're not afraid to talk to. The police think they're going to go out and make friends with the community because they have $5 million and a horse. But it doesn't work that way. So, for example, I think the Hilliard Heinz report cost us $290,000, $270,000. We would like to see that same money used for community survey about what the community actually wants to happen. The chief talked about having a dashboard for the Hilliard Heinz recommendations. Once we look at Hilliard Heinz, we look at Cahoots or any of those organizations and programs, they all circle back around to be in relation with one another. So we really need to be mindful of where we're spending that money. So, to the community that's watching, today is one of those days where public comment at the budget hearings are open. May 27th is another day. So you all need to sign up and speak about the things that you want to see happen. There are other groups in the community that are asking the community to come in focus groups and say what it is that we want to see happen. But ultimately, the community is saying that we want the community to be able to solve the problems. Give us that same funding that you're going to give LMPD, and we can expand exponentially the work that's going to be done if you give us an opportunity to do that, because we're saying we are equipped. We are mental health specialists. We are violence prevention specialists. We already know what to do. We're not getting training to start doing this. So I think that the community really wants to see more investment in providing services that are close to the community. Because if you send Officer Friendly out to come and work with me and I'm, you know, a gangbanger or whatever, I don't want to hear from you. I want to talk to somebody who has the experience and knowledge and has made it to the other side of that. So, you know, as a social worker, you know, I think also I talked about there is a statewide crisis and abuse hotline that is operated by 7 counties. So they're talking about, with the deflection model, for example, you know, sending out other service providers. We already have an infrastructure in place to do this. And so we don't need an additional $600,000 to make that work. What you need to do is take that $600,000 and pay social workers to respond. So, you know, I'm not going to take up too much time, but I'm going to give you an example of that. So as a social worker, I'm on call at least once a month. And so I take calls of abuse and neglect to children, to adults, calls for people who are in mental health crisis. However, I can only respond to those reports that I get about children because there is a fund from the Commonwealth of Kentucky that supports me sending my workers out to do that. Whenever I get a call about an adult in distress, physically, mental health, you know, a senior citizen, I take the call and there's absolutely nothing I could do because we don't have the fiscal capacity to be able to address those calls. So for example, if Metro could take that same $600,000 and provide it to the crisis line to pay social workers to go out on those calls, we can get something done.
Oh, and Pamela just said something right on point to what you're talking about. Pamela E says they need to add social workers to 911 calls. There are a lot of situations police should never be involved in, yet they are the first point of contact, and they already show up aggressive. I've been to many a peaceful protest, and the police officers are in riot gear, cussing people out, putting their hands on elderly people, putting their hands on children. So they should not be the first responders, and they don't prevent crime. Like, they're called after the crime. They're like secretaries with badges and guns. Like, they're called after the crime actually takes place. So yeah, definitely on point, Pamela. I want to lift up too, Phil said that status quo types in Louisville government are frighteningly indifferent and dishonest. And Nancy said deflection programs do not need to be managed by LMPD. And it's, you know, it's baffling to me that Shantae, you talked about the need for social workers to be there, and most social workers have a proven track record of solving, you know, disputes, domestic violence disputes, child disputes, like all these sorts of things. And the police don't have that same track record, but they're given money without question oftentimes. So yeah, and we're about 7 minutes out from the end of the program. I want to kick it to Corey to just talk about a few calls to action before we jump back into wrapping up the conversation. If you're just tuning in again, I'm Shantrice. We are talking with Black Lives Matter Louisville and with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth about the police budget hearing that happened this week, and how we can deter some of that money from police who have been proven to not be able to solve crimes and actually escalate violent issues, and instead put that money in places like social services that would prevent the need for aggressive policing in the first place. So Corey, if you can just talk about a few calls to action, and then we'll get into more of the discussion.
Absolutely. So if you are worried about even one thing that we said this afternoon that happened in this budget hearing, if there is one thing in your community that you think needs more money, you need to leave a public comment. We have been told by Metro Council people that the best way to get in touch with them about the budget is to leave a public comment. So that is the link that's going across the screen right now, the bit.ly MC-public comment. You can also call your council member. You can find their information. You can email them, set up a meeting, build a relationship with them so that when you call them, when you email them, they answer because you're their constituent. You can also tune into the budget hearings. They are long, and I'm not going to say they're easy, but put it on while you're doing your dishes. Put it on in your headphones while you're taking a run and just listen. A lot of these things that our council people say, that it doesn't end up on the notes. This 4.5 hour or 5 hour LMPD budget hearing, the notes that they submitted were 2 pages long. There was nothing in there about any of the questions that were asked or about any of the answers or anything about money. So tune in. make your own, make your own discoveries about things that are going on in the budget, and tune in and hear what questions they're asking and they aren't asking. And you can do that by going to the Louisville Metro Council page.
And I'll say too, thank you for that, Corey. Corey is leading a lot of really good work on note taking for these budget hearings, and they are in depth. They're well organized. We also, in this slide presentation, have a lot of the questions that were asked word for word, along with the chief's answers. So that'll be published on all of our pages, the same places you can find this live stream. You can find the slideshow with links with specific answers from the Metro Council meeting. And yes, Nancy, I would love to host a community conversation to have more people in on this. We know that some people have different work schedules. We are totally happy to host a community conversation about this, help people get ready to speak at a council meeting. Yeah. They're going to be voting on the police budget very soon. And the mayor seems to think that, the people who are most negatively impacted by policing don't matter, and that we're a burden, and we have to show them that that's not the case. We are essential. We are essentially the shareholders of Louisville Metro. So yeah, I just want to put it back on y'all for final comments as we start to close out. And please also let everybody know with your organization what specifically can be done to support your work in either defunding police or abolishing police, or just making a system that is radically different than the one we have now. And I'll start with Rebecca.
I'm getting unmuted. Okay. So my closing thoughts are, I definitely agree with everything that everybody lifted up today. I think knowing where the money is going and what these programs are doing and how they're all interrelated and what is ultimately going to be happening with the data that is captured on all of us, and this most importantly, or most disproportionately in Black neighborhoods, and that how that information and that data is going to lead to more or higher incarceration rates and higher over policing and things like that. And I also think it's really important to understand that, like with the DOJ coming in, they're coming in at a time that we've been calling for community-based reform, right? That like we want our grassroots communities to do this reform, and the DOJ is coming in to sort of take that over. So understanding where this money is going within our reforms, I think is important. And I think that's kind of where the work that I've been leaning into. So if folks want to deal with that, they can get in touch with BLM to get involved in the Invest Divest work there. And then with LCBF, I will drop the a volunteer link in the chat, and you can jump on our hotlines and collecting data from folks inside that are incarcerated, and understanding sort of what's happening in our within the deeper levels of the criminal justice system and how that relates to LMPD and where it starts.
Thank you, Rebecca. We'll go to Shantae next.
Okay. Just a closing, really want to see more people show up at those budget hearings to hold your legislators accountable. So whoever your Metro Council is, you can also reach out to them directly to let them know what you think about this budget, how you would like to see the money spent. And also, if you could visit investdivest.org, you can learn about more information about the conversation to defund the police and what exactly that means. And so these budget hearings are really the crux of that conversation. We're talking about how we divest monies and budgets away from law enforcement and more into these community alternatives. So again, you all also have the ability to make public comments. Please tune back in if you have questions that you would like to see any of the Metro departments answer, but particularly LMPD. They will be asking these departments to come back and respond to some of the questions that they felt were not answered. I know one of those dates is going to be June 14th. that I believe the Office for Safe and Healthy Neighborhoods is coming back. And so let your legislators know who are those community organizations that you trust, that you want to see them provide funding to. And so it may not always look like providing money to those direct organizations, but these metro departments can contract with your favorite grassroots or your community organizations to do the work that we need to do. So, please make sure that you're engaged. You share this video with your friends and family, and have your own conversations amongst your own friend and family groups about what we can do to divest from the police and invest in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we say defund police, it's because we understand that putting those resources in other places will remove the need for police in many situations. And so thank you so much for everything you bring. And I'm hoping that social workers get more credit for all the work they've done to diffuse a lot of these situations and eliminate a lot of these situations, to be quite honest. I hope and pray that we get more social workers who are doing this work instead of police officers. And I'm gonna go to Corey next.
Well, y'all, we as in KFTC, some KFTC members and some other folks have been watching these hearings together. Like I said, they're tough to watch. It's nice to have somebody there in the Zoom chat with you to say what the hell when something crazy happens, honestly. Like Shantri said, we're also trying to take really good notes. So if you sign up for one of those, you'll get access to this notes document. We're going to try to start putting out a newsletter. So you really don't have to be there for all hours of these meetings, but definitely try to tune in, even for part of it. Like Shantae said, like any way that you can get involved is so important, because they are riding on us not watching. That is the status quo. That's what happens. That is why they can show up so unprepared for their job, is because they know that for the most part, folks aren't watching. So we are putting them on watch, and it's time that they start spending our money wisely. So
thank you so much. And we'll have a separate conversation about alternatives to policing. A lot of people wonder, like, if we defund the police, what's going to happen? I can tell you what happens when we fund the police. You get murders by police. You get police assaulting children, raping children, and getting away with it. So, yeah, there's definitely a better world, and we can do a better job of keeping us safe by preventing the need for police in the first place. So we'll talk more in a later session about alternatives to policing. I want to thank everybody that participated in this. I want to thank everyone who commented. It's really important that we do stay on top of this, because otherwise, like Corey said, they will continue business as usual. I'm really, really excited to know that so many people have been reaching out to try to get involved with the budget process. Although the Metro Council may not acknowledge all the people who have made comments on their budget form, I've gotten dozens of emails and texts and DMs and calls about this and how people can tap in. I know a lot of people, I've helped them, fill out the budget form or prepare for city council meetings. There is, I believe, one more city council meeting before the final vote. And you'll just go on Metro website. We'll have some links in the comments with how to get engaged. And we hope to see you soon on one of our KFTC sessions for listening in on the budget and taking notes. Again, I'm Sean Trees. I'm really happy y'all joined us, and we are right at our time. So we're going to close out. Again, if you want to get involved with either Black Lives Matter Louisville or Kentuckians for the Commonwealth or Louisville Community Bail Fund, please hit us up in the DMs or in the comments so we can get you plugged in. Yes, and Nancy is right. Tonight the meeting is at 6, which is why we had this with enough time for you to listen to us, get a snack and breathe, and then go to that meeting at 6.
And let me say, Sean Trees, yesterday the question was asked yesterday whether or not the Metro Council people were paying attention to the Facebook page. And I just want to point out that during the live meeting, one of the Metro Council members clicked like to that question. So they may not acknowledge it, but when you put those questions in the comments, they are looking. They may not always acknowledge it, but it's very important. So make sure that you show up.
Thank you so much. And I would say too, go back and copy and paste your questions and answers and comments that you thought were really important, and just put those in the budget comment form, because they are relevant. And a lot of council members have said to me that they can archive that and they can go back and look at that. The Louisville Metro clerk is really, really on point. Like, I don't know how many there are, but at least the one I usually talk to for signing up for things, like she'll make sure the right person gets it. So if nothing else, copy and paste your comments on social media and put them in that form. We have the link up now so that you can let the council members know. And again, that meeting tonight is at 6 p.m. EST. And we'll tune in for one more recap next week where we'll go over some of the other budgets. We spent more time on LMPD because they are 40% of the budget. Again, they only solve 30% of the homicides. And we don't even know how many of those that they are lying about, because as we know, they did lie about Breonna Taylor. So yeah, I just want y'all to keep that in mind. Stay informed. Thank you for tuning in. And we will be back next week to do another recap. Thank you, everybody.